Kuala Lumpur. It is a name that sounds familiar to many of us in America. But what if I told you this city was once a lethal swamp? A place where nearly all of the first 87 miners who arrived died tragically within weeks from malaria and disease. Would you believe it? Back then, there were no houses and no roads. There was only dense jungle, treacherous mud, and death lurking in every shadow. Yet, in less than 170 years, that very same wilderness has transformed into one of the most exotic and vibrant metropolises on Earth. This is the city where the Petronas Twin Towers once stood as the tallest in the world, and where the Merdeka 118 now rises as the second tallest building on the planet. How did a starting point so utterly disastrous turn into such a global miracle? The answer lies with the people who gambled their very lives on this land. This story isn't just a dry history lesson. It is a vivid testament to the power of resilience, a lesson that every one of us needs to hear today. Stay with me until the very end. Once you know the full truth, you will look at your own life in a completely different way. But before we dive deep, I want you to ask yourself one question. If you were standing in the middle of a damp, suffocating tropical rainforest, without a map, without hope, surrounded by nothing but mud and malaria, what would you do? Because that is exactly where our story begins. Let's pull the camera back. Imagine the glass towers vanishing. The concrete melts away. The highways turn back into raw earth. The jungle surges forward until the entire city disappears. All that remains is a fork in the river. Murky, tea-colored water flows over red laterite soil. You hear the deafening shrill of cicadas. And then, nothing. There isn't a single sign that something monumental is about to happen here. What do you think? How did the worst possible starting point become one of Southeast Asia's most pulsating cities in less than 2 centuries? We have dived deep into the archives, old maps, colonial photographs, Malay manuscripts, tin mine blueprints, and travelers' diaries. Using artificial intelligence, we have painstakingly recreated exactly what this place looked like, sounded like, and even smelled like at every stage of its evolution. This wasn't magic. It is a grounded reconstruction. When the records were clear, we followed them. When we needed to add vivid detail, we made sure it was based on historical reality. Behind every layer of this city are the people who staked everything. A miner who stayed when everyone else had died. A warlord who rebuilt from the ashes. A colonial official who rewrote the laws after a devastating fire. A prime minister who tore down a racecourse just to prove a point to the world. This is their city, and it looks nothing like what they could have ever imagined. Before 1850, the Selangor interior barely appeared on any practical maps because there was simply nothing worth drawing. Picture a low-lying dipterocarp forest so dense it smothered the riverbanks and blotted out the sky. Sunlight filtered through in a hazy, brownish-green gloom. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and river mud exposed at low tide. The Klang River ran an orange-brown hue, saturated with laterite silt. At its confluence with the Gombak River, the very spot that would later give the city its name, there were no villages. Only the occasional fishing post of the indigenous Orang Asli could be found. Kuala Lumpur literally translates to muddy confluence. People often tell that as a joke today, but back then, it was a literal, gritty description. These river junctions were natural stopping points for Malay traders, places to rest, read the currents, and make decisions. Then, in the 1840s and early 1850s, the logic of the jungle was overturned by a single word: tin. The inland hills of Selangor were teeming with cassiterite ore. European industry was hungry, needing vast quantities of tin for canning, soldering, and manufacturing on an unprecedented scale. Chinese miners began to push upstream from the coast, following the veins of ore deeper into the heart of the wilderness. By any logical standard, this was a terrible choice for a settlement. It was prone to flooding, infested with malaria, and hemmed in by hills. No one chose this spot because they saw potential. They chose it because it was the furthest point upriver that heavy cargo boats could navigate. Someone had to lead that first expedition, and the man who ordered the journey would not live to see its results. Around 1857, a date widely recorded. Even if the details remain debated, a small group of Chinese miners arrived at the confluence by sampan. Most were Hakka, sent up under an agreement between the Malay chief, Raja Abdullah, and Chinese traders in Klang. The traders wanted the tin, Raja Abdullah wanted the tax revenue. The miners were simply the tools of both. They built makeshift huts out of atap, leaves, perched on high stilts to stay above the floods. Cooking fires sent plumes of smoke into the forest canopy. You would have heard the rhythmic thud of axes and the first metallic clangs of land clearing. The river rose and fell with the seasons, a constant reminder of the name they had given the place. The camp looked fragile and temporary. It was the kind of architecture that screamed, "We are here for the ore, not for the land." It was a transit station, not a city. There were no streets, no grid, only the logic of the river and the singular drive for survival. But here is the part that will give you chills. The jungle took its toll. Of that first group of roughly 87 men, the vast majority died within weeks. It wasn't violence that took them, but malaria and fever. The tropical interior of the mid-19th century was a death trap for those without immunity. These men had come from entirely different landscapes, and the city that would one day become Malaysia's capital was nearly abandoned before a single permanent house was ever built. Survival, not ambition, was what kept a handful of men at the confluence. They stayed because the tin was real. Can you imagine the sheer terror of those remaining miners? They watched their comrades fall one by one, yet they still picked up their pickaxes. That is when the story truly began. Through the 1860s and into the early 1870s, the confluence transformed, not gracefully, but rapidly and dangerously. A row of wooden atap houses pressed against the river. A Joss temple was erected. A crude market sold salted fish and rice. The sounds, according to travelers in similar frontier mining towns, were layered. The chatter of Cantonese and Hakka at the stalls, the sloshing of metal washing tin by the river, and at night, the heavy silence of a community that knew violence was always close at hand. Two rival secret societies, the Gi Hin and the Hai San, controlled different mining sectors. Between them lay a volatile mix of credit, labor, and eventually, blood. Then came the Selangor Civil War. From roughly 1867 to 1873, a Malay royal succession dispute merged with Chinese factional fighting, spiraling into uncontrollable conflict. Kuala Lumpur was both an economic prize and a literal battlefield. The town was attacked, burned to the ground, temporarily abandoned, and then swarmed once more before the smoke even cleared because the tin was still there and the prices were still rising. For brief periods, Kuala Lumpur was a ghost town. Can you believe that? A boom town that refused to die even when the boom was interrupted by war. The British, watching from the coast, decided this chaos was bad for business. They intervened, a decision that would reshape not just the politics, but the very physical fabric of the city. However, the most important figure in Kuala Lumpur's early urban phase wasn't a British official. It was Yap Ah Loy, the leader of the Chinese community, who held the title of Times Capitan China. He was no Democrat. He was a cross between a mayor, a warlord, and a lead creditor. He ran the plantations, the gambling dens, and the system of debt-bonded labor. He was a ruthless businessman, but he was also a builder. After the war, it was Yap Ah Loy who directed the reconstruction with enough raw power and capital to make it stick. A town of a few thousand Hakka and Cantonese in the commercial heart, Malay traders on the fringes, and the first Tamil laborers appearing began to rebuild along the river in a rough, organic grid. The singular commercial spine they created would later become Petaling Street. Then came the Great Fire of 1881, followed immediately by a massive flood. The Atap town burned fast, clean, and without mercy. This was the city's greatest small surprise. The fire that should have ended the settlement ended up modernizing it. The British resident, Frank Swettenham, used the disaster to achieve what he couldn't through politics. He ordered that the entire town be rebuilt using brick and tile. No more Atap, no more thatch. The physical character of the city was forged by a catastrophe. A colonial city was born from the ashes of a mining camp. You're wondering, aren't you? How does a disaster become a turning point? That was the moment everything changed forever. In 1880, Kuala Lumpur became the capital of Selangor State. By the 1880s and 1890s, the evidence of growth was everywhere. New brick shophouses lined the main streets. Moorish-style government buildings began to rise near the river. The Times Padang, times a wide ceremonial green, was cleared near the confluence to impose a sense of colonial administrative order. This was the center. This was where power performed. The sound of the city was the sound of construction. Bullocks dragging loads of bricks, Tamil labor gangs chanting as they worked, the first hum of telegraph wires. Magnificent Moorish, Victorian official buildings rose right next to Chinese commercial streets that were still as chaotic as they had been in the mining camp days. Then came 1886, the railway. The Klang to Kuala Lumpur line was the pivotal moment of the century. Before the railway, Kuala Lumpur was an important settlement. After it, it became a node in a global network, and a node in a network accumulates power faster than anything around it. Tin could now be moved with industrial efficiency. People arrived in massive numbers. The interior was finally manageable. The railway chose Kuala Lumpur over every rival settlement, locking in its dominance. The station the British built was extravagant. Moorish arches, minarets, and vaulted ceilings. It was a fairy tale palace for trains in a city where most side streets were still unpaved. The aesthetics were not accidental. They were a declaration of permanence, of ambition, and of the kind of place this was intended to become. And the railway brought something else. South Indian Tamil labourers, recruited under contract to build and maintain the British infrastructure across the peninsula. They arrived in huge numbers, and they stayed. This third major ethnic community took root, adding Tamil quarters, vibrant temples, and a rich culinary culture to a city that had never quite finished blending its existing parts. Kuala Lumpur soon became too important to remain just a state capital. In 1896, it was named the capital of the newly formed Federated Malay States. The administrative building boom of the late 1890s gave the city its iconic colonial skyline. The Sultan Abdul Samad building, completed in 1897, anchored the Times Padang Times with its copper domes and clock tower. This hybrid Moorish Victorian language spread from the river junction like ripples from a stone. The architecture made a calculated argument. The minarets and domes were both Islamic and Victorian. British power was framed within a Malay cultural aesthetic. It was a complex visual language that still defines the city's horizon today. At the street level, however, the story was far more complicated. The city's population was now clearly segregated by ethnicity. Malay times, Kampong's times sat on the outskirts. Chinatown was packed densely around Petaling Street. Tamil labourers lived in clustered housing blocks, while European villas were perched on the cool, breezy hills. Horse-drawn carriages and the first bicycles shared the paved main roads, while mud tracks remained everywhere else. The prosperity was real, but it was incredibly uneven. Chinese merchants were doing well, and the commercial streets were buzzing with life. Meanwhile, Tamil labourers on the rubber plantations surrounding the city lived in conditions nearing slavery in barracks, having almost no urban presence or political voice. Malay farmers were often pushed off land that was reclassified for colonial development. The multicultural city celebrated today was partly built by a colonial system that enforced economic roles based on race. The Chinese traded, the Indians laboured, and the Malays farmed. It was an arrangement that would haunt the city's politics for generations. The 20th century arrived, and rubber replaced tin as the primary engine of growth. By the 1910s and 1920s, the results were visible from any high point. The city was surrounded by a geometric green carpet of uniform trees. The scent of processing latex drifted on the quiet morning air. Inside the city, running water, electricity, and trams had been running through the main streets since the 1910s. The sounds were now the ringing of tram bells, the chugging of car engines, and the clatter of typewriters in government offices. The city had begun to hum with modernity. the Chinese commercial district grew vertically, with 3- and 4-story shop houses, clan associations, and opera stages tucked into alleyways. Stalls were piled high with produce. The majestic hotel anchored the social life of the European and Straits Chinese elite. Yet, the Tamil plantation laborers remained nearly invisible in the urban record, living in barracks outside the city proper. Then came 1929. The Great Depression crashed rubber prices at a speed the city couldn't handle. Plantations laid off workers on a catastrophic scale, and Kuala Lumpur absorbed the newly unemployed like a sponge that was already full. Urban poverty skyrocketed. For the first time, squatter settlements appeared on the city's fringes, a new geography of precariousness that would never entirely vanish. The structural fragility of the boom years was suddenly exposed. Kuala Lumpur had been built on commodity prices it didn't control, fueled by a global market it couldn't predict. The city that looked like it had solved the equation of growth in 1925 had actually solved nothing. It was just starting to stabilize again in the late 1930s, when the most violent fracture in its history arrived. It didn't come by land, but from the air. In December 1941, Japanese forces pushed into the Malay Peninsula and moved south with a speed that shocked everyone, including the British. Kuala Lumpur fell in January 1942. The British evacuation was surreal. European residents fled by car and train. The colonial apparatus collapsed with terrifying efficiency. The Sultan Abdul Samad building was occupied by a different flag in a matter of days. The occupation of Kuala Lumpur was a time of silence. Markets closed under strict curfews. Armored vehicles patrolled the main roads. The night was quiet, but it was a silence imposed by fear, not sleep. Through 1943 to 1945, there were desperate food shortages. Sweet potatoes replaced rice as the staple food. Rubber plantations were abandoned, and the jungle began to slowly reclaim the city's edges. The occupiers' treatment of the Chinese community was particularly brutal, sharpening communal tensions in a way that would last for decades after the war. In the jungles surrounding Kuala Lumpur, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army operated under grueling conditions. Mostly Chinese and mostly invisible in official records, they were nonetheless a powerful presence in the city's later memory. The occupation ended in 1945. The British returned, but they returned to a city where the people had seen colonial power vanish and then reappear. They had drawn their own conclusions. The argument for continued British rule wasn't just weakened. For many in Kuala Lumpur, it was shattered. The most brutal period in the city's history had accelerated the drive for freedom by proving that British invincibility was merely a story that, once debunked, could never be told with the same conviction again. What followed wasn't a clean break toward freedom. The Malayan emergency lasted from 1948 to 1960, a period where British forces fought a communist guerrilla movement, largely drawn from the rural Chinese community. Kuala Lumpur became a city under visible security pressure. There were checkpoints at the urban limits, rolls of barbed wire, and armored cars. The jungle's edge was once again a zone of threat. Inside the city, political energy exploded on every frequency. Malay nationalist organizations met in the Times kampongs. Chinese community councils navigated suspicion from both sides. Indian labor leaders demanded rights within whatever framework they could find. Then came August 27, 1792, Merdeka. Independence. The scene at the Times, Padang Times at midnight, is one of the most iconic moments in modern Malaysian history. The very ceremonial green that the British had cleared for cricket and colonial parades became the stage for their departure. Colonial grammar was repurposed for the act of leaving. A new flag was hoisted. The crowd roared. Tunku Abdul Rahman led the cry of Merdeka 7 times. The photographs of that night carry the weight of something truly historic happening in the heart of the colonial city the British had built. Stadium Merdeka, constructed specifically for the occasion, stood as a physical monument to that moment. The symbolic geography of independence was intentionally enacted in the colonial centre, a choice both poetic and complex, given what that centre had represented for 60 years. But Kuala Lumpur in 1957 was still a modest city, a large colonial town rather than a burgeoning capital. The ambition to make it something worthy of its new political status was a policy choice yet to be made. The first real test of the new nation, the test that would force that choice, was still a decade away. On the 13th of May, 1969, racial riots erupted in Kuala Lumpur, following a general election that pushed communal tensions to the breaking point. The violence was concentrated in specific neighborhoods. Streets that had been bustling market corridors became checkpoints, emptied under curfew overnight. The aftermath was both monumental and physical. In 1971, the government launched the new economic policy, a state-led restructuring aimed at increasing Malay economic participation and dismantling the colonial-era ethnic divisions that had hardened inequality over decades. Kuala Lumpur's physical landscape changed forever. New government housing and predominantly Malay townships like Petaling Jaya, Shah Alam, and Cheras sprang up on the urban outskirts. Petronas, the national oil company founded in 1974, became the financial engine for what was being planned. Rural Malays migrated to the city in massive numbers through the 1970s and into the 1980s. The city's ethnic geography was shaken up. New neighborhoods formed, old ones transformed. The urban footprint expanded in directions no pre-war map could have predicted. The sharpest irony was this: the violence of May 13, paradoxically, gave birth to one of the most aggressive urban development programs in Southeast Asian history. The government decided, with almost absolute conviction, that the city had to grow its way out of inequality, despite all the displacement and new inequalities that growth itself would create. In the early 1980s, a new prime minister, with an almost supernatural appetite for concrete and steel, took power. Kuala Lumpur would never look the same again. When Mahathir Mohamad became prime minister in 1981, the decade of construction that followed remade the physical reality of Kuala Lumpur faster than any period before it. The skyline shifted year by year. Cranes bloomed on every horizon. The LRT train system began cutting through areas that had been quiet times, kampongs times, only a decade earlier. Highways were built to stitch the Klang Valley into a single linked urban region. Glass office towers sprouted in the Golden Triangle. The sound of the city became the constant thrum of jackhammers and concrete mixers, the beep of reversing trucks, and a layer of construction dust that the monsoon rains would wash away, only for the dry season to bring it back again. At the heart of it all stand the Petronas Twin Towers. Constructed between 1992 and 1998, they briefly held the title of the world's tallest buildings upon completion. Designed with Islamic geometric patterns integrated into their floor plans and draped in a postmodern facade of steel and glass, they were a deliberate, towering manifesto. Modern Malaysia, Islamic Malaysia, a Malaysia filled with pride. The site itself was not a natural urban centre. It was the former Selangor Turf Club, a colonial-era leisure facility that was physically raised to make way for the clearest symbol of post-colonial ambition in Southeast Asia. The subtext was anything but subtle. Then, in 1997, the Asian financial crisis struck like a sudden gale, right in the middle of half a dozen mega-projects across Kuala Lumpur. By 1998, the city's skyline became a globally recognized image of a different sort. Half-built towers frozen in time, cranes standing motionless atop concrete skeletons that had ceased to grow. It was a portrait of excess paused at the moment of maximum exposure. Yet, the towers survived. The city survived. The following decades brought different challenges. Not dramatic shocks, but a steady, grinding attrition. Through the 2000s and 2010s, the question was no longer whether Kuala Lumpur would grow, but whether anyone was steering that growth well enough to keep the city livable. To the south, Putrajaya rose from what was once lush forest, a planned federal capital with vast Islamic boulevards and monumental civic buildings designed to move the seat of government out of an increasingly congested Kuala Lumpur. Early photos of Putrajaya show a city that looked almost eerily vacant. Wide roads and stately plazas waiting for a population that was slow to arrive. Back in Kuala Lumpur, the reality was a 7 a.m. gridlock on the Plus Highway. A city designed around the automobile was beginning to be strangled by the very cars it catered to. The LRT, monorail, and KTM commuter lines, all expanded, yet they operated on different gauges, used different ticketing systems, and were run by different operators. It was an infrastructure archipelago rather than a unified network, a literal, siloed infrastructure that made cross-city public transit more complicated than it ever needed to be. At the street level, commercial change was relentless. Old shop houses were torn down to make room for high-rise condominiums. Bukit Bintang began to throb as the new commercial heart, pulling investment away from the old colonial core around Merdeka Square. Two centers of gravity, pulling in different directions. The darker side of this progress became visible both in the data and on the ground. Luxury towers and global shopping malls sprouted alongside slums that were never cleared and never saw investment. Inequality was sometimes literally vertical, a high-end skyscraper casting its long shadow over a shantytown on the very same block. And then, a small irony became one of Kuala Lumpur's most defining global identities. Precisely because the formal economy kept tearing down and replacing the informal one, the hawker stalls, night markets, and mamak shops opening at 3 in the morning survived in the gaps. The food culture that the world now celebrates came directly from the parts of the city that planners simply forgot to modernize. A new generation of Kuala Lumpur residents has begun to ask the questions their parents weren't yet able to ask. What does this city owe to the people who can no longer afford to live in it? If you stand at the confluence today, you will see that the Klang and Gombak rivers still meet at the same point. The water remains a laterite brown. The name still holds true. But the riverbanks are now walkable, cleaned up under the River of Life project. Heritage murals adorn the Masjid Jamek LRT station. Riverside parks sit exactly where the first ATAP huts were pitched back in 1857. The river branch that was once a geographic accident became a contested resource, then a colonial planning axis, then was buried under overpasses and forgotten. Now, it is being reclaimed, not just as infrastructure, but as memory. Looking up from the riverbank, the Merdeka 118 tower looms large against the sky. Completed in 2023, it is now the second tallest building in the world. Its spire reaches over the very Padang where the flag of independence was first raised in 1957. Two moments in time are now in conversation across the skyline. The city's history is looking directly at itself. The MRT now runs underground, stitching those old islands of transit together on a massive scale. The hawker stalls, still open at midnight. The metropolitan area now holds over 8 million people. Bahasa, Malaysia, Mandarin, Tamil, and English flow through the same mamak cafes without friction. The legacy of every wave of migration since 1857 sits at the same table. Yet, this is not a city without unfinished business. The floods still come. Kuala Lumpur's drainage system still struggles when the heavy rains hit, and those rains are becoming more severe. Housing prices push the youth to the outer fringes or away to Singapore and Melbourne. It raises the question of whether a city can ever truly outgrow the problems of one generation, only to harbour the problems of the next. And beneath it all, the mud remains. Under the concrete, under the LRT tunnels, under the high towers and the highways, the laterite riverbed of the confluence is still the same riverbed. The founding logic of Kuala Lumpur has never changed. This is a place where goods, people, and capital meet at a river junction, and each era merely renegotiates the terms of that meeting. It has grown from 87 miners, most of whom died within the first few weeks, to a metropolitan region of 8 million. From a malaria-ridden transit point at the end of a river line to the home of the second tallest building on Earth. This isn't a story of a grand plan executed well. It is the story of a place that consistently refuses to fail. Through gang wars and fires, occupation and violence, financial collapses and unchecked urbanization, it has always found at the bottom of every disaster a reason to build again. Every era has destroyed something and built something else on the same patch of earth. The buildings we have reimagined tonight are gone, but the choices that shaped them are still shaping the city you can walk through today. The river branch is still there. Go find it. As you stand by those banks, pause for a moment and imagine. Imagine the last hacker miner of that original 87, drenched in sweat and shivering with fever, yet still gripping his pickaxe, because he believed that tomorrow the tin would save his family. Imagine Yapar Loy, the man who carried this city on his shoulders after the fires, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion, yet still ordering the kilns to fire bricks, because he knew that if they stopped now, everything would be lost. Imagine the Malay mothers in 1969, clutching their children as they fled the smoke of the riots, tears streaming down their faces, yet whispering to their little ones, "One day, you will have a better life." These real people, with their fears, their pain, and their burning hopes, are the reason Kuala Lumpur stands tall today. They are not heroes from a textbook. They are ordinary people who chose not to give up. I believe deeply that the story of Kuala Lumpur is not just for Malaysians. It is a powerful reminder for all of us, especially those who have weathered the ups and downs of life, that failure is never the end. Every time this city was burned, occupied, or thrust into crisis, it rose again, stronger than before. That is the true power of the human spirit, the ability to renegotiate one's fate on the very same ground where they once fell. That is a lesson we must pass on to our children. Teach them that even if the world is chaotic, even if life pushes us into the mud, we can still build towers that reach the heavens not with concrete, but with willpower and perseverance. If this story touched your heart today, if it gave you a sense of hope for your own life or for the next generation, please share this video with a friend or a loved one, someone who might need a reminder that nothing is impossible. And if you want to join me in exploring more miraculous urban stories from around the world, please stay with us. Thank you for being here until the very end. The river branch is waiting for you, and the future still has so much left to be written.